It could be 3,000 years old. It could be 2 years old. It doesn't matter. What matters is that it matters to you and that it creates meaning in the world for you. So to me, that's what makes it a myth.
Hello everyone and welcome to Geekoscopy101, the podcast that explores the intersection between science, story and play with me, your host Dr. Janis Kisten. Today we're exploring the intersection between pop culture, mythology and religion with anthropologist and content creator Dr. Vivian Asimos of Incidental Mythology. Alright, welcome to the show, Vivian. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm really well, thanks. I recently discovered your work and I was quite excited to chat to you. I'm always down for anything video game and research related, and I've been a long fan of mythology as well. I think maybe a lot of kind of nerdy, geeky kids who might be going into science will have that phase where they're like into dinosaurs, and then they're also into like Egyptian mythology and then like Greek mythology. I had my Egyptology phase like back in like primary school, and then fell out of it. But I think more recently it's coming back because of video games like Assassin's Creed and God of War and stuff that highlights mythology and stuff. So I was really keen to chat to you. Your videos and your blog posts seem very interesting, it's very kind of detailed just nomenclature that you have for things, and I'm like, geez, we have words for this stuff now. It's crazy. So tell us a bit about yourself, Vivian, and what you do.
Yeah, so I'm an anthropologist of religion and mythology, and I specialize in contemporary storytelling as mythology. So basically what I do is I spend too much of my life really overanalyzing all of the things that we just kind of do and take in for fun. So video games, TV shows, movies, but I spend quite a lot of time mostly with the video games, and basically talking about them, analyzing them, and exploring exactly what they tell us about ourselves and the world around us and how we understand that world. All of that kind of lovely stuff.
For sure. Do you start off wanting to study like stories and video games and then get into anthropology to go down the field, or did you start off wanting to be in the anthropology field and then get into studying video games and stuff?
It kind of happened a little bit all at the same time. So when I initially went to do my undergraduate degree, I was actually in creative writing. And in America, at least, I know that every university system is slightly different, but I did my undergrad in the United States, and there you have a lot easier time switching between different departments. So I am a nerd, so I had extra time before I graduated, so I could take fun classes, and instead of taking underwater basket weaving like normal people would do, I was taking religious studies courses.
You know what I mean? I didn't just make that up right now. Underwater basket weaving.
It might be a thing, I don't know, but so I, instead of taking ceramics or something kind of that probably people would do for fun, I took actual degree level courses, and I ended up just double majoring with them both, religious studies and creative writing. And what made me change my mind was, it was like the fourth course or something that I took in religious studies, but it was religion and Tolkien. So I spent an entire semester just talking about Lord of the Rings and geeking out with other people who love Lord of the Rings and talking about their myths and religion in it and religion for Tolkien and how that translates to Middle Earth. And it was 3 hours every week that I just got to be a geek, and it was so much fun. But I also learned a lot in it. And we read Foucault and got into some nitty gritty and learned a lot about religion. And that was when I went, I can take this stuff that I'm learning in all of these other courses and apply it to the things that I love. And I can apply it to video games, and I can apply it to Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter and TV shows and reality television shows. And I can apply it to all of those different things, and it all still works. And that was when it converted me. So it kind of all happened at the same time that I went, oh, I can actually do this all at once. And so during my undergrad, all of my final papers for all of my courses, if I could make it about a bit of popular culture, I did. So I had so many papers that were about Lord of the Rings, so many papers about Legend of Zelda. That was just what I did. And so when I went to go do my master's, it just made sense to just make that everything that I do, as opposed to just final papers to confuse my my professors.
For sure, that's really cool. It's I think it's one of a nerd or a geek's like secret dream to have like their geeky stuff be their main thing. Doesn't always work out, but when it does work out, I'm sure it's magical. Because I mean, we talked earlier about like, cause I interview like other people involved in video game research and like therapy and stuff, and like they just enjoying themselves over there. I'm like, geez, we're experiencing two different versions of academia. I can tell you that. One of the interesting notions that I've seen with your work is that you put forward this notion that our current pop culture is kind of a contemporary like mythology. So can you like distill that into explaining how our pop culture, geek culture is kind of like our mythology? Like, what is the mechanism that's at work there?
So, I mean, when we kind of look at these stories that we always think of more traditionally as mythology, like the Greek stuff, the Egyptian stuff, you know, the things that you were into a while ago and then fell out of, those things. When people talk about them, they talk about things like how they helped to explain the world for the people at the time, or that they were part of the religion at the time, or there was always a reason that people were telling these big stories. And so part of that story then would be, if we don't have really myths now, unless it's, you know, a Christian mythology, then why did we stop telling these stories? What made it so that way we stopped telling these stories? And there really isn't a good answer to that question. And so really you have to kind of think about, okay, what were these stories really doing for people? And what stories are doing that for people now? And that's where we come up with popular culture. So there's a lot of different definitions of myth, but the one that I use is that a myth is a narrative, or something similar to a narrative, that an individual or a community uses to understand themselves and the world around them. So if there is a narrative that you use in order to understand the way the world works, to understand your place in society, to understand the way that you as an individual are meant to navigate the world, that could be a Greek myth, that could be a Jesus myth, that could be Star Wars. And so it means that what I'm looking at is what matters to people, and I don't really care where that story comes from. I don't care who wrote it. I don't care when it popped up. It could be 3,000 years old. It could be 2 years old. It doesn't matter. What matters is that it matters to you and that it creates meaning in the world for you. So to me, that's what makes it a myth. And I mean, our geek stories, and I'm sure a lot of people listening to this will relate, you really love them, and they really like carve out your way in life and how you see things. And I know you were kind of almost teasing me before we started recording about how much I talk about The Legend of Zelda on like my video essays and stuff on YouTube, but I will talk about it again briefly. When I was doing my master's, it was on the Legend of Zelda series, and I met someone during fieldwork, so I was just kind of chatting with people who really like the series, and one of the people I chatted to had a tattoo of the Triforce from the games on their arm. And so I mentioned it because, of course, I'm going to mention it when I'm talking to them about it. And they said that it's a really solid reminder for them about how to live in the world, because the story of the Triforce is that it represents how individuals should have an equal balance of power, wisdom, and courage within them. And so whenever they needed to make a really big decision, whenever they were kind of struggling with something, it was a nice reminder that they should be approaching things with an equal balance of wisdom, power, and courage. And they wouldn't put the fact that they were a Hylian on a census record. They're not like spending their Sundays praying to the goddess Hylia or anything like that. But it matters to them, and it helps to define who they are as an individual and how they interact with the world. And so for that person, the Legend of Zelda is a myth. It's an important individual mythology for them.
Speaking of The Legend of Zelda, my previous guest, which I think the episode just dropped today, that day we are recording, Nathan Miranda is a good friend of mine. We worked on the same labs, an aquatic biologist, but he recently published like a paper. I think it had to do with like socio-economic stuff with the environment and stuff like that. But he made like a figure in there, like, and he was joining like 3 things, and he made it into a Triforce. So there's like a socio-economic paper out there for the environment, and there's a Triforce in it. So you want to go check that out.
Amazing.
I think I'll do a picture of it in the video here. But he's a big Zelda fan as well, and we have plenty of chats about video games and stuff like that. So yeah, it's I think it's really cool because I'm a very story driven player of games, so I enjoy playing games that have narrative, have story arcs, and yeah, it's something that I identify with a lot, and I do find important themes in there. Themes that just are interesting, and I mean some of these things are based already like on mythology, like you think of God of War or Assassin's Creed and stuff like that, but other times there will be themes and stuff that are not so blatant but are still pulled from and yeah, when it comes to like religion, a lot of stuff is like built on older stuff, like going back all the way to like, you know, Mesopotamia, and there's been like, you know, things that just permeate down here and there, and there's these old stories that are just retold in different ways across the world. It's very like fascinating, and I think that kind of permeates now into our culture as well, like video games and the comic books and movies and stuff. There's always some type of story you can identify with just based on like the way that it's told and like the setting and like the characters, and it might be like similar, but just different parts of it change around, and it's always interesting to see that when you're involved in different kinds of media. What kind of through lines or like themes you notice a lot in different media that interest you?
I think there's a really important aspect of agency that I think sometimes gets lost in conversations around popular culture. I know that at least when I started doing a lot of this, there would be a lot of conversation about, well, can something be meaningful if it's, essentially made to make money? Yeah. So Star Wars is, I think, a really great example of this. It's meant for entertainment, and it's this huge system owned by Disney, which is obviously a huge profit-driven industry. And when they create a story or a new thing for Star Wars, can it be meaningful to people if really people are creating it? Like, the backing behind it is there in order to make millions of dollars. And there's a really wonderful article by Joseph Laycock who wrote about the history of He-Man and how basically, I think most people would probably know this, but in the 80s when people would make cartoons, it was purposely to sell toys and not the other way around. Yeah. And so basically Mattel had this surfer guy doll that they kept trying to sell as like surfer built up guy and no one was buying it, and it just wasn't selling at all. And so they decided that they wanted to make a TV show for it to help sell it, but they didn't really know what to do. So they brought in myth experts. and they scrapped everything Surfer and wrote He-Man, the Masters of the Universe, which is now like huge and has spin-offs and a recent spin-off with She-Ra on Netflix. And it started selling. It's the same doll. But it's no longer Surfer Dude, it's He-Man. And what changed was the story. And that people, and even children, were able to say, I'm going to buy into that story. I'm not buying into that story. And they can actively choose. And there's a huge amount of agency that's involved in storytelling. And we see that a lot in the kind of geek nerd culture with things like fan fiction and Let's Plays and streamers. And all of these people are people who are partaking in the media, but doing so with their own stories overlaid into it and their own agency that's being kind of helping to control the story. And if there's nobody there that cares enough to put in their own agency into the story dies and it becomes the Surfer guy instead of He-Man. So agency is really important. And yeah. And even like old stories and these old myths that we keep talking about also had really important aspects of agency. So when stories would change over time, looking back, some people said that it was because of, like the oral tradition and how it would kind of, people couldn't remember and that's why the story shifted. But that's not accurate. And there's been loads of studies by people who do much more hard sciences than I do to show that like oral recitation is actually a better way of memorizing than writing things down. The thing that people did was they changed stuff because they wanted to. Because they wanted to for their own agency over the story. And that can be for a multitude of reasons, whether that's an individual need or whether it's a social need. If you have a story that's about a hero that goes and saves a civilization from a corrupt government, if you like your government or you might want to keep people from overthrowing your corrupt government, you might try to change that story and alter it to be slightly different. And now they're not overthrowing a corrupt government, for example. Or you change the story the other way and you make it an overthrow of a corrupt government in order to get the people on your side in order to make social action. This is what people did, was they changed stories in order to fit the location of where they were or the social situations that they were in. And that's just something that we're still seeing now. She-Ra used to be this very sexualized, very female, hetero-driven idea of a woman, and the Netflix version of it is very LGBT forward, has a lot of different people of color in it, and has a non-binary character, which would never have happened in the 80s. But they changed the story to fit the fact that we're in, 2020, which is when that came out, and we need to have this story change in this way to represent the society that we find ourselves in.
It's kind of like a software update to the mythology. It keeps getting updated the more it's told. I had that thought recently when I thought about like religious texts and how sometimes they're taken so literally. And I'm like, it's been like hundreds, thousands of years. Like, shouldn't there be a software update? And then I thought, now, like, while you're talking, it came to mind, like, what if writing these things down and making some permanence to it kind of detracted from their original, like, way of being transmitted? If they were, like, told orally and kept changing from person to person, but writing them down actually stop that initial kind of projection. And I wonder if you can model what would have happened if that didn't happen.
It would be interesting to see what certain things would be like now. But I think even with things that are written down to a certain extent, like, there are so many different forms of Christianity that are all basically having their own agency over the same story, but just seeing different things in it, and therefore claiming that ownership, and then they fight with each other over the slightly different interpretation of the same things. Right. That's religion, baby.
Yeah. don't want to get too deep into that. What are some of the other more surprising things that you found during your research and studies?
Well, so I think there's like two aspects of it that are somewhat related, which I honestly didn't quite realize. I was interviewed earlier this week, and it wasn't until I was talking to them that I started realizing, I was like, oh, this is probably very much related to one another. But you know, in the academic world, when I was kind of fighting my shot there that this stuff matters, it was a big uphill battle that this stuff matters. It was something that I was constantly having to say. We talked a little bit about this before we recorded, of constantly having to explain what the internet even is before you get into it, or you were saying having to, you know, justify video games from its economic output of like, this is all the millions of dollars it makes. Like, that's what's supposed to make it meaningful. Yeah. But, you know, you have to do this thing to show that it matters. And there is an element of that I think, you know, the people who love this stuff feel that it's not just that I have to defend it because I'm studying it, but even when I'm not studying it, I'm having to defend it because I love it. And I'm having to explain that I'm not childish for wanting to spend my weekends playing video games instead of doing whatever adults do. That I want to play board games with my husband. I want to, you know, play video games and spend my time doing that stuff, or watching, you know, Star Trek reruns on Netflix, you know, instead of going outside. Like, this is something that I feel like I have to constantly be defending. And I there is definitely that related notion. And so one of the things that I have found that has been really important was for the people who do just enjoy this stuff to hear some of the same arguments I make to academia. And I, you know, when I first started my blog and stuff, it was for, it was under a different name, and it was when I was doing my PhD, and I would kind of write these little quick analyses that was relating, you know, important anthropological stuff to pop culture, because it was fun to do that. And I found that most people that followed it were not traditional academics. It was people who just enjoyed this stuff and wanted essentially justification that they were right to be really enjoying this stuff. And that, you know, it is right for it to matter. And we all know that it's right for it to matter, but it meant something more when there was, like, I don't know, anthropology keywords and concepts thrown in. It made it somehow more necessary and important. But so I think to me that has been a really fascinating thing to dig into, is to see how much that kind of social pressure on pop culture, the amount that people either frown at it or don't frown at it as being so socially oppressed, and how as soon as you start to poke holes in it to show that it really matters, how much the people who love it can really breathe. When I finished my PhD, during my defense, my viva, I had my internal examiner was very questionable about the whole thing. He kind of went in thinking it was a bit silly, and we actually had a really hard time finding an internal for me, because I think a lot of people thought it was a bit silly and not wanting to really be involved with it. And he said at the end of my viva that he was quite surprised that he left it feeling a lot of respect and that these people had dignity. Which, I mean, first of all, I wanted to be like, well, yeah, no, duh, they're people. But but on the other hand, I was really happy that I was like, oh, I like changed someone's opinion on this, and they might not continue to go through life looking down on these people who just are trying to enjoy a Saturday, you know? So, I think it's been surprising to see, how much I can change, you know, one side of its minds, and how much I can give people that reassurance and that justification for themselves, and tell them that they do matter, and to keep enjoying what you enjoy and don't be ashamed of it.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's really important to have things that you enjoy guilt-free, you know, even though they're not like mainstream. It shouldn't like give you anxiety to enjoy something. It's weird. So Yeah, and it's kind of one of the things I strive for with this channel, because it is trying to take academic look into like geek culture and geeky things, and like I suppose find some reasons why these things are not just totally just a waste of time, or just an escapism or just entertainment. There's something useful there. I've always kind of felt that. And I mean, I've been playing like video games all of my life, and I still ended up graduating with a PhD, so what like detracted for me compared to like other people, so I know it's different between people, but still it's one of those things where it's like there are different ways to live life. There's not like one way, like one group of ways that's going to work for everybody. Like, people are too variable, people are too different to all be into the same things and find the same things useful. We discussed earlier that our current media, current pop culture and geek culture are contemporary mythologies. But if you like look forward into, if this time had to be something like ancient Egypt or ancient Greece or whatever, what do you think people will look back on? What will they take from our era? Would it be anything useful? You think it'll be another cycle?
There's always usefulness, because I think when you really dig into ancient mythology, and it depends on what kind of analytical tools you're using, but most of the time what you can really get into, especially from a social anthropological point of view, is you see how societies are structuring themselves. So I am I've been typically using structural anthropology, which is a bit old school, but it's kind of fun to do, and I think it's a really interesting way of looking at things. But basically its backing is that as we kind of live in a society or in our culture, we have certain ways of categorizing the world around us. And that's going to be very specific to where we live and what culture we live in, and because each of us have the different ways of categorizing. And we are taught this through society of particularly like when you're young and you get things pointed out and you say, oh, that's a tree, but that's a shrub, even though it's kind of technically a tree, but they're different. And this is how we kind of categorize things. And this is a person who is one of us, and that's a person that's not one of us. And those people get categorized differently. And this whole categorization system is also the way that we produce things within our culture. So whenever we write a story, or we tell a story, or we are crafting a tabletop role-playing game for us and our friends, all of those categorizing systems are going to be reflected in what we're doing. So when you use a structural anthropological method to look back at an old story, essentially what you're doing is you're revealing a lot about the social structures and the way they categorized things and the way they understood an us versus them, or a this versus that mentality within their narrative. So someone could do that looking back at us. And I think that you can see a lot of also social tensions of when people start to break the categories or reshift the categories. And there's been a lot of that going on in the last 10 to 15 years of people trying desperately to change the way that we categorize certain people, how we categorize certain aspects of the world, and that as our stories are continuing to be shifted, we can actually see and map those changes within our popular culture. So if I were to, I don't know, be reborn in another body in, 200, 300 years from now, and I was more interested in old stories than contemporary stories, then what I would be doing is I would be taking all of these stories and essentially mapping them to show the social change, because I'm very hopeful and optimistic that it will be successful. But I would like to see that kind of mapped out of, well, here's an old story of an old Star Wars from the 70s to, the newest version of Star Wars that's going to happen in 10 to 15 years from now. And you can actually see how the different categorical structures altered over the course of those, 20, 30, 40 years. So yeah, and again, that's comes also down to agency and those storytellers' agencies, and that's how those stories change, is from one person saying, I believe in these kinds of social changes, I want these social changes to happen, I'm going to change the story to reflect those social changes that I want to have happen. And then someone else who just loves those stories, really lives by those social changes, and really identifies with those social changes, that's their mythology now, and then they continue to live out in new ways, and that's how the world changes.
For sure, that's pretty cool. That's interesting. Speaking of agency and storytelling, and you even mentioned tabletop role-playing games, that's I feel like is a very new. It's a still adorning, burgeoning media compared to, I suppose, video games, and definitely compared to movies, and definitely compared to written stories. What do you think anthropologically is going on? There's anything interesting that you've seen, questions that have been answered with in the science, or just with people's thoughts in the fields?
Tabletop.
Yeah.
Like in the tabletop role-playing games.
Yeah. Or is it still too new for anthropology? Yeah.
No, I mean, there's a lot. I mean, I would love to spend a huge amount of time and effort digging into it. My current research project is on cosplay, but I see a lot of similar things going on in the two worlds. But spending a lot more specific time on tabletop games would be fascinating. But there's a lot of different aspects of myth creation that you could really dig into. Again, that agency over stories, because obviously quite a lot of tabletop role-playing games have a kind of base story that you start with. So D&D has a very set story structure. Here are your key monsters that you use. Here are some key places that you can go to. Here's how you structure things. Here's the type of ways you encounter. It's all very kind of set stories, but you have agency within it in order to change it to reflect the way you want. I've been listening to a real play podcast, because this is what I do with my spare time. Is I've been listening to a podcast of a tabletop role-playing game. And but it's a tabletop role-playing game that's based on Star Wars.
I literally did that earlier today.
There's so many of them, and I love them. But I've been listening to one that's based on the Star Wars universe, and I'm not super, like, I like Star Wars, but I'm not. I don't know all the intricacies of the world, so I'm learning a lot about it through listening to it. But again, there's set canon for those. There's a set story. There's a set locations. There's even set characters. They've been bringing in stories or characters from, canon Star Wars to kind of have little cameos in their in their tabletop game. For sure. But they kind of can craft this whole thing within it. And it's actually an interesting one, just as a complete side note, because they started it like way before Rogue One started being discussed.
Okay.
And their story is that they're the ones that got the plans to the Death Star.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
And then I was like, but I'm like been re-listening to like these back ones, and I was like, what are they going to do when Rogue One comes out? Are they going to have to like adjust their whole story to fit new canon? Like,
I'm pretty sure for them Rogue One doesn't exist in their world.
So yeah, I mean, it's like, I'm gonna be really fascinated because I've been having to listen from the beginning, so I'm about a year in now, because that's just all I do all day is listen to this podcast. But so yeah, there's those kinds of elements of what choices people make to adjust to a story when they don't choose to adjust to it. But then there's the element of embodiment and the character embodiment and what that does for a person, and the discussions of identity and identity play. And I don't mean that in a sense of like when people play Dungeons and Dragons, they forget who they are as a person. I am much more in the know to know that that's not what happens. No. But identity play is really fascinating because there is some aspect of residual carryover. And when you talk to people who pick certain cosplays, this happens as well. And there are people who do this with tabletop games, where when they create a character for role-playing games, and I have done this myself, is that I will create a character that I want to be. In some facet. It might not be their entire personality is like perfect in my head, but you know, maybe they're not as smart as I would like them to be, but they're a hell of a lot braver than I am as a person. And I want to just live out that courage, bravery, do something stupid for the sake of the fun story kind of person. And I want to play that even if it's just for 2 hours, you know, with a thing of pizza and my friends. But that carries over into me, and I'm making those decisions based on identity, based on personality, and based on who I want to embody. And that identity play definitely carries over, and there's really interesting things that happen there. So sure. Identity play, story crafting. Yeah, there's all sorts of different really fascinating things. I don't know if like you said, academia is quite caught up, but hopefully one day, or I'll do it. Who knows?
Well,
one of the two will happen.
From what you were saying, like it's. I mean, you generally have kind of a grasp on role-playing games in terms of there are set stories that you can play, but I think a lot of people do just create their own stuff in certain settings or create their own worlds, and it's not necessarily anything set. Like they could make everything up, just like they just use the rules that Dungeons & Dragons or whatever game system is released. And like you said, they will, if they do have something that's canon, like it's obviously not going to happen the same way. And other game masters sometimes will change the story based on what players do, so it's a collaborative, like storytelling changing experience, which is what I think
improv
is unique, about it, compared to like video games where you still at somewhat of the mercy of the game developers. In most cases, you are at the mercy of what they developed, what they coded for. Whereas tabletop role-playing games is much more open and there's much more agency. There's much more potential for it, I think.
Yeah, I think improv is a really fascinating aspect of performance that I think I would really like to get into as well. And that would really play into aspects of tabletop role-playing, of the nature of improv and the way that people interact with it, and the way that you have to really be on your feet. You know, a good game master is going to be somebody that doesn't get upset when the players don't do the story that they've sketched out, but that just kind of go with it and go, I guess we're not doing the whole thing that I spent 3 hours planning. I guess we'll do something different. You know,
I think that's not necessarily, I think, good or bad. I think it's bad, like if you continue to do that going forward. But I think a lot of like game masters make the same or similar type of mistakes early on because they just don't have experience. And even when you're talking about players making characters that they want to be, I think a lot of players, their first character will be like that in the first couple, but then later on they might make characters that are just totally different because they want to like experiment and stuff. So it'll be interesting to like see what's going on there, like mechanically and scientifically, because it is, I think, one of those, it's kind of like a journey of a role-playing gamer. It's like we all have these little like story arcs outside of the game within the games, which is kind of weird, and it doesn't always happen that way, but it is like a common theme that certain things happen early on in like your game mastering career, early on in your playing career. That is common, unless you're totally weird and different, which people are very different. It's always gonna happen the same way. But yeah, I'm very excited about role-playing research. I think it's going to be interesting field to look forward to. Hopefully you guys get funding for all of that stuff so you can actually run some studies.
Because I have found when I was starting to do cosplay and I was having to kind of define out what cosplay is, because academia loves definitions, and I started kind of getting caught up of like, well, is historical reenactment technically cosplay? Is drag technically cosplay? Like I started like getting really into the nitty gritty of it, but I ended up doing it. I ended up doing it very similar to Myth, where I'm just kind of letting people tell me when something is cosplay to them, and that's when I'll take it. But it really opened up a lot about the different aspects of, I'm calling them dress plays, but it could just be all different aspects of role play, because cosplay is a version of role playing in the sense that pretty much everyone I've talked to so far has been very much of the, it doesn't matter how close you look to the character or what your body type is compared to the characters or how good your costuming skills are. What matters is whether or not you are acting proper to the character when you're in the costume. It's all about the performance of the character more than everything else. It's all about the performance of identity, and role-playing is very much that of it's about the performance of the identity. It's about knowing, not metagaming, because your character doesn't know that, so you've got to not do that, and it's all about proper performance.
Yeah, I mean, we could go for hours talking about that, but it might be a good stopping point. But before we completely end, so you said you started like early on with a different blog during your PhD, but you have like a new media brand now called Incidental Mythology. So how did that come about? Like, what's your aims with that?
Yeah, so I ended up making it into a much bigger thing because, like I said, people were surprisingly interested in what I had to say. So Incidental Mythology is based off of the idea that our contemporary popular culture is our mythology, but it's all done incidentally. It's not done on purpose. It's just the way that things are. So that's where the name came about. But the idea is that I spend a lot of time talking about everything that we've talked about today, talking about how different aspects of popular culture are myth and actually digging into it. So instead of just saying it, actually showing, well, what can we say about this thing? And so I've got blog posts that I post up on the website. I've also got a YouTube channel where I do some video essays about once a month, where I pick something and I kind of dig into it. So they're all little small snippets of probably what could be much huger, bigger projects all in and of themselves, but it's just what I have time to do at that moment of, I played a Legend of Zelda game, so I've got lots of thoughts about it, so I'm going to produce some stuff about it. So you can kind of see where a lot of this stuff intersects and there's a lot of through lines, so you can see where I've referenced things multiple times because I'll like stuff. But yeah, so it's all about popular culture as mythology, incidentally, and all sorts of different aspects of it.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. I recommend it so far from what I've seen. So
Thank
it's
you.
the blog and the YouTube channel. Anywhere else we can find your other works?
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram. Both Incidental Mythology has its own, but it's pretty much just so that way if you want to know when things get put up, it'll be on there. But you can also follow me individually at Vivian Asimos on both of those. So either one, and you'll get updated.
For sure, we do. So thanks so much, Vivian, for joining. It's been a really fun chat.
Thank you for having me.
Sure. Cheers, guys.